Welcome to the Crimson and Motive podcast. I'm your host, Alexandra. Join me as we explore the dark, twisted stories of murder, serial killers, and the demented. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Crimson and Motive. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode, which is the first that is being posted on Monday mornings. I hope with this change I will make Monday mornings a little more bearable. First, I wanted to give a very special shout out to an amazing lady that has been following the show from the very beginning and is always excited when new content is up. So Sherry, if you're listening, thank you so much for the support. And for all of my listeners out there, if you would like an honorable mention, you can reach me at Crimson and Motive, that's AND@gmail.com, or on my social media platforms at Crimson and Motive. So last week, I mentioned I may have some good news, and I'm ready to announce it. I have been debating on whether or not I should do this for a while, but after a few listeners reached out to me asking if I could, how could I say no? So with that said, I have decided to not only have the podcast on podcast platforms, but I will also be adding it to YouTube as well. I know that some of my listeners have been struggling to keep updated on episodes, so I decided that I will post on YouTube as well, so that not only they can keep up, but my closed caption listeners could join in on discovering my true crime cases. I should hopefully have the content up and running sometime this summer on YouTube, so stay tuned. Lastly, I have another great piece of good news. I have had a few people talk to me about merch, so I'm hoping within the next few months to have merch readily available to my favorite true crime listeners. And again, I thank everyone for the support. Now, let's get into this week's case. I posted last night on social media a sneak peek into today's case, but I warn you, today we'll be talking about sexual assault and incestuous relationships, so listener discretion is strongly advised. I chose this case because not only did I want to discuss another murderous couple, but I wanted to discuss a couple that both came from unstable homes and if the dynamic would be any similar to the previous cases I covered. At the end of the show, I will be talking about if I think this case can be related to the cases from past episodes. The sources used for today's episode are Serial Killer Files by Dr. Harold Schechter, Women Who Kill by Al Cimino, and the episode on the West from the TV show World's Most Evil Killers. So, let's talk about Fred and Rosemary West and their House of Horrors. Fred West was born in 1941 in Great Britain. He inherited his mother's narrow eyes, big mouth, and had a large gap between his two front teeth. He was anything but handsome, as he appeared unkempt and disheveled. As a student, Fred did not perform well and left school at 15 illiterate. He was constantly bullied by other classmates who dubbed him a mummy's boy. But the kids weren't lying. He was very attached to his mother. Too attached. She taught him the ins and outs about sex because, you see, Fred was raised in an incestuous household. His father was rumored to have a relationship with his sisters, which in turn, Fred would start to become more interested in his sisters. When he was 17, he was in a motorcycle accident, which left him in a coma for a week. Experts believe that this would be the reason his sexual appetite would become more intensified. His head trauma would further be intensified when he attempted to shove a hand up a girl's skirt while standing in a fire escape. When she pushed him, he fell over the railing, which would cause more damage to his frontal lobe. By the time he was 20 years old, he was a habitual thief, but avoided jail time as his general practitioner claimed his epileptic fits were to blame. In 1961, he was a convicted child molester. What was he accused of being a child molester of, you might ask? He raped his 13-year-old sister and impregnated her. He was unapologetic and said to the police, "Doesn't everyone do it?" He was forced out of the home to start working at building sites, and there would be further allegations of attempting to attract underage girls. In 1962, he met and married a troubled teen and part-time prostitute named Catherine Rena Costello. At the time, she was carrying another man's child. The man was an Asian student. So Fred forced her to write a letter to his mother saying that they adopted a mixed-race child named Charmaine. Not long after, they would have another child, Anna Marie, in 1962. During this time, Fred worked as an ice cream truck driver and later at a slaughterhouse. This would help Fred find not only an opportunity to prey on more young girls, but would help intensify his craft as he got older. Fred's sexual gratification, though, was watching Rena have sex with other men, bondage, anal, and oral sex. But she grew tired of it and left in 1967 to Scotland without the children. So Fred set his sights on their roommate, Anna McFall. Rena would come back to discover that they were now living in a caravan, with Anna now being pregnant with Fred's child. Rena also noticed that there were 8 unsolved cases of sexual assault in the Gloucester area, and the perpetrator matched Fred's description. So Rena went to the police and claimed that Fred was a sexual pervert who should not have the children. The case was given to Hazel Savage, but little did Hazel know that this would not be the only case in dealing with Fred West. Anna was now begging Fred for marriage now that they were expecting their first child together. But this set off Fred. He ended up killing her, dismembering her body by cutting off her fingers and toes to keep them as souvenirs, then buried her in a field in Much Marcle. When Anna disappeared, Rena moved back to the home for a short time. It would be during this time that Fred would begin to molest 4-year-old Charmaine. On January 5th, 1968, 15-year-old Mary Bastholm would be abducted at a bus stop in Gloucester. Although Fred is suspected of killing Bastholm, he was never formally charged. With the increased attacks in the area, young girls were beginning to be scared to go out alone, but not 16-year-old Rosemary Letts. Rosemary also came from a troubled home life. She was born on November 29, 1953. Her brother Andrew said that the children were not allowed to play like normal children and would be beaten with objects if they were too noisy for their father's liking. Rose's father was a schizophrenic that was rumored to have an incestuous relationship with her. Her mother was a severely depressed woman who received electric shock therapy while pregnant with Rose. This may be one of the many reasons why she doesn't display any normal emotions now. As a child, Rose would rock back and forth violently to the point where furniture would move. She was also overweight and bullied for it, which would make her increasingly violent. Rose would also walk around the house naked as an adolescent and would sneak into her younger brother's room to fondle him. But on November 29, 1968, Fred West would pick up Rose from the bus station and would quickly become a couple. Like the others, Rose also became pregnant rather quickly and would give birth to a daughter named Heather. But while she was expecting, Fred wasn't around to help as he was incarcerated for stealing, which included stealing from his job site. For his crimes, he was sentenced to 9 months between 1970 and 1971. But Rose was growing increasingly frustrated with raising children that weren't hers, and Charmaine was a defiant little 8-year-old girl. Anna Marie knew when to be quiet, but Charmaine couldn't. So Rose killed Charmaine and told Anna Marie that Rena came to get her. When Fred was released from prison, he was not angry at the discovery that his daughter was killed. Instead, he helped Rose cover up the evidence by burying the body under the kitchen floor at their residence of 25 Midland Road. And again, he kept the fingers and toes of his own daughter. After Fred was released, he convinced Rose to work as a prostitute while he looked into a peephole. He would only join in if it involved bondage, sadism, lesbianism, or vibrators. But then eventually, Rena came back to the house looking for the girls. She already tipped off the police about him before, and Fred knew that she was going to find out Charmaine was murdered. So, he got Rena intoxicated and then he strangled her to death. He then dumped her body near Amick Falls in Much Markle. With the ever-growing number of children in the household, Fred and Rose hired a babysitter, 19-year-old neighbor Elizabeth Agus. On multiple occasions, when they would return home, Elizabeth would ask them what they were doing. They would tell her the truth. They would attempt to lure young girls because if Fred did it alone, they would not get into the car. But with Rose, they might actually get in. Rose eventually admitted to Elizabeth that she was a prostitute and would attempt to lure Elizabeth to join in their sexual perversions. Elizabeth obviously refused, but one night she was drugged and woke up being naked in bed next to Rose and Fred. Not long after, in January 1972, Fred and Rose would wed at the Gloucester Registered Office and move to 25 Cromwell Street. They used the ruse that it was for the growing family, but Fred had other reasons. He would turn the cellar into a torture chamber that would later be masked as a nursery for the 7 children that would eventually be living in the home. The first victim to test out the torture chamber would be his 8-year-old daughter, Anna Marie. She was stripped naked, hands bound behind her back, and Rose would hold her down while Fred raped her. Due to the injuries sustained, Anna Marie would miss numerous days of school and was threatened that it would happen again if she told a single soul. In 1972, 17-year-old Catherine Owens became the live-in nanny. This diabolical duo stripped her naked and raped her. She managed to walk away from the incident, but was threatened that if she told anyone, she would be gang raped. But when she got home, her mother found the bruises. Her mother called the police and charges were laid against the Wests. But something ridiculous happened. They managed to convince the magistrate that it was consensual sex, and for that, they only received a small fine. After Owens, Linda Goff, who was a seamstress, became their live-in nanny, but she would not be as lucky. She was murdered, dismembered, and buried in the floor of the garage. Linda's family tried to look for her, but when they approached the Wests, they said that she had moved on from the place. The family deemed it suspicious as Rose was wearing Linda's slippers and Linda's clothes were still hanging up at the house. In August 1973, Fred's first son, Stephen, would be born, and not long after, in November of 1973, they would abduct 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper. They abused her both physically and sexually, and then killed her by either strangling her or suffocating her, then also dismembered her and buried her under the house. The following month, 21-year-old university student Lucy Partington accepted a ride from the Wests, but when they started to go in the wrong direction, Lucy knew she was in trouble. The Wests took her to their house and shoved her in the torture chamber for a week. They would then repeatedly rape and torture her. When they got bored with her, they also killed her, then dismembered her, and then buried her under the house. 3 more women would meet the same fate: 15-year-old Shirley Hubbard, 19-year-old Juanita Mott, and 21-year-old Swiss hitchhiker Therese Siegenthaler. The Wests would torture their victims using extreme bonding techniques that consisted of either a rope or plastic-covered washing lines to suspend the victims from the beams in the cellar, and then gag the victims with tights, nylon socks, and brassiers. Another young woman would be tortured at the house after being lured from a school for wayward girls. When she got to the house, she was sent to the torture chamber, where she noticed 2 other girls also being held prisoner. She was subjected to rape and sexual assaults by both Fred and Rose and was forced to watch the other 2 girls being tortured. She would later testify in court as Miss A. Within the next decade, Rose would have more children, but due to being a prostitute, some of the children weren't Fred's. But she wasn't the only person pregnant in the household. Anna Marie would end up being pregnant as well by her father. However, it was an ectopic pregnancy. After the pregnancy was over, she fled the house to seek refuge with her boyfriend. After Anna Marie left, Fred put his attention towards his daughters Heather and May, and Heather would be beaten if she resisted. In August of 1979, the Wests abducted 17-year-old Allison Chambers. They raped and tortured her, but after they murdered her, they ran out of room in the cellar, so they buried her in the back garden. 3 more children would be born between 1980 and 1982, and many abductions would take place, but no murders. But then the final victim would be murdered in June 1987. The West's daughter, Heather, was growing tired of the abuse she was receiving at home and confided in a friend. The friend would go to a policeman walking the beat. Heather was then murdered, dismembered, and buried in the garden next to Allison Chambers. Finally, the West's luck would run out in 1992. A girl they abducted told a friend about the incident, who then went to the police. On August 6, 1992, police arrived at the West residence with a warrant. They found pornographic evidence and arrested Fred and Rose for rape and sodomy of a minor. Rose was charged with assisting Fred. Hazel Savage, who was now detective constable, received the case and remembered the names from 3 decades prior. While asking around, Savage became curious of what happened to Charmaine, Rena, and Heather. She checked tax information and national insurance records and noticed that Heather had not been employed, drawn benefits, or been to a doctor in 5 years. With this discovery, police removed the younger children from the home and placed them in foster care. Rose tried to commit suicide during this time, but her son Stephen ended up saving her. But the case would fall apart against the Wests. The 2 girls that came forward initially now refused to testify in court. But Savage now had an itch she needed to scratch. She needed to know what happened to the other women. Savage returned to the house with a search warrant on February 24, 1994, to dig up the yard to look for Heather. 20-year-old Stephen answered the door and said that Heather left home to work at a holiday house, but it was a running joke in the family that if any of the kids misbehaved, they would end up under the patio just like Heather. When Rose came home from work to discover the police was digging up the yard, she was furious and began to verbally attack the police. Fred, who was now working at a building site 20 minutes away, received a call from a frantic Rose telling him to come home. Fred and Rose were interrogated, and the 2 of them were not worried about what happened to their daughter Heather and was more concerned about their backyard being torn apart. Rose said that Heather was lazy and disagreeable, and Fred said that Heather was a lesbian and addicted to drugs. He said, quote, "Lots of girls disappear, take a different name, and go into prostitution." The Wests stayed up all night talking to each other. Fred would ultimately agree to take the blame. He admitted to Savage the next day that he did it, but both him and Rose were arrested. Fred said that he sent Rose out of the house to run errands, but then later recanted his statement, thinking that the police would find nothing in the yard. 5 days later, they found human remains in the backyard belonging to Heather. Fred confessed again and said that during an argument, he strangled her but tried to resuscitate her in a cold bath. But he removed her clothes first. When it didn't work, he strangled her one more time with tights and tried to toss her in the garbage bin. But when she didn't fit, he dismembered her body by cutting off her head and legs and buried her in the garden. But when the police found the remains, they brought Professor Bernard Knight, a forensic pathologist, to the scene where he discovered there were 3 leg bones found at the scene. Fred confessed to killing 17-year-old Allison Chambers and 18-year-old Shirley Robertson. The latter, he admitted, was his teenage lover that was also pregnant with his child. Police would move their investigation to the West cellar, where they would uncover 6 more bodies. Fred would later cooperate and would sketch a map to where the other bodies would be located. They would also uncover Anna's, Rena's, and Charmaine's remains. On December 13, 1994, Fred and Rose appeared in court for Fred's charges of 12 counts of murder. Fred tried to comfort Rose, but she resisted. He later wrote to her that, quote, "We will always be in love. You will always be Mrs. West all over the world. That is important to me and to you." Just before noon on New Year's Day, 1995, Fred West was found deceased in his cell, having hanged himself with a ripped-up bedsheet and shirts to make a noose. Rose would be charged with 10 counts of murder. She was not charged with Rena nor Anne because they took place before she arrived. Her trial started on October 3, 1995. It would be an uphill battle to prosecute due to circumstantial evidence. Her defense attorney was certain she was telling the truth and that she was not involved with any of the murders because of the reaction she had when she found out about Heather. Apparently, she was completely distraught. But was she a grieving mother or an acting accomplice? But the prosecution team had something up their sleeve. They found a negative image of Charmaine dated April 1971. They brought in Professor David Whitaker, a forensic odontologist, who was able to confirm through dental work that Charmaine died shortly after the photo was taken. This meant that Rose had to have killed her because Fred was in prison during the time of the killing. Rose was quickly found guilty and showed no remorse when given a life sentence. In 1996, she had an appeal turned down. The Home Secretary said that she would never be released and she would have to serve her whole sentence behind bars. In 2000, she secured legal aid for a new appeal. She pleaded that excessive publicity and checkbook journalism were the reasons she did not receive a fair trial. However, when the application was submitted, a documentary came out showing Fred admitting to all of the crimes him and Rose committed. Later on, she would almost marry 36-year-old bassist Dave Glover, but they pulled out last minute due to the publicity. He would later be fired from his band Slade for his association with West. Rose was moved to an all-women's prison in 2008 where she received her own private room, a TV, a CD player, and her own private bathroom. Now she spends her days listening to The Archers, Neil Diamond, plays Monopoly, cooks, and receives deliveries from Avon and Argos. In 2018, the Sun reported that she found religion and that God would forgive her and that Fred made her do it. Fred and Rose's daughter May believes that there are still at least 30 bodies left to be found, but we may never know, and it appears that Rose will never confess anytime soon. After unearthing the grisly discoveries of the bodies, Fred and Rose's residence at 25 Cromwell was demolished and the land was made into a public walkway. And that concludes the Wests and their house of horror. What I want to discuss is how Fred and Rose worked together. I find it fascinating that two people came from incestuous households and both suspected of having brain injuries would find each other and become one of the most heinous couples Great Britain had seen in the 20th century. But what I find truly fascinating is how the MO is exactly the same with Fred and Rose as it was with the Gallegos and Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. The power would start with the men, but as time went on, the women would become more complicit and would sometimes become the one with the power by the end of the murders. Now, I did some research to see if electroconvulsive therapy would be harmful to a baby in utero, but I only found a study conducted by Likeness et al., which they discovered that there was only a 7.1% mortality rate, and follow-up on other adverse effects were scarce or not noted. So it's possible that she could have suffered some sort of brain damage, but I would assume that the brunt of Rose's condition was likely due to the incestuous relationship she had with her father. Therefore, Fred and Rose would have both come from hostile households and both examples of empiricism in the nature versus nurture debate. But yet, they still acted the same as the other couples mentioned on the show. I would love to know what you think, so please send me a message on social media or by email at crimsonandmotive, that's AND, @gmail.com, and maybe you will get selected as an honorable mention. And that's the show for this week. See you next week for another episode of Crimson and Motive.